$250 fine, dropped on my doorstep for growing tomatoes on my land. No warning, no knock, just a certified letter. Signed, Cordelia Vance, H.O., a president. I'm on my porch, mud still on my boots, reading this crap, when I hear tires crunch gravel. There she is, clipboard, designer sunglasses, stalking my fence line, snapping photos of my chickens, my greenhouse, my raised beds. She spots me with the letter, smirks.
You might want to rethink what kind of neighborhood you're in now.
Honey.
Then she struts back to her Lexus like she owns the place. I look down at her signature, look up at her taillights disappearing, and I smile. Because she never once checked the deed. This land? My grandfather bought it in 1962. And guess what, Cordelia? Your entire HOA access road, your clubhouse, your precious patrol path, all sit on my property. Someone finds you on land you own. What do you do next? And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened. My name is Harlan Dodd, 58 years old, third generation Tennessee. I've got the kind of hands you only get from actual work, not a gym, not a weekend hobby, but 30 years of real daily labor on 12 acres outside of Cookeville. My grandfather Earl bought this land in 1962 for almost nothing, because the county considered it rough terrain. Rocky hillside, a creek running crooked through the back 40, soil that needed coaxing before it gave you anything worth keeping. Nobody wanted it. Earl saw something different. He saw a homestead. He cleared it himself, acre by acre. My father Dale built the main house in 1971, two-story farmhouse, wraparound porch that groans in February when the temperature really drops, the kind of sound a building makes when it's been through hard winters and survived every one of them. Dale added the barn, the root cellar, the chicken coop, and 24 fruit trees that still produce more apples and pears than I can give away every September. When Dad passed in 2009, I inherited the deed, the mortgage-free land, and the quiet understanding that this property wasn't just real estate, it was the family. For 30 years, none of that was anybody's business but mine. Then came the Ridgecrest planned community. In 2017, a developer called Whitmore Properties bought the farmland adjacent to my east boundary and carved it into 140 new construction homes in 18 months flat. Cookie-cutter colonials, stamped concrete driveways, lawns that looked like putting greens. The kind of neighborhood where someone reports you to the board if your trash can is visible from the street on a non-collection day. Whitmore formed the Ridgecrest HOA before the first family even moved in. Drafted CC and Rs so thick you'd need a paralegal just to understand the font size requirements for mailbox numbers. They elected a board, and they elected Cordelia Vance as president. Now, Cordelia. You've met Cordelia before, even if you've never met this Cordelia. She's 62, recently retired from a mid-level county zoning office, where she spent 23 years accumulating just enough bureaucratic authority to develop a serious appetite for it. She drives a pearl-white Lexus SUV that she parks at a deliberate diagonal to occupy 2 spaces, every single time, without fail, like it's a personal philosophy. She sends emails at 6 a.m., She uses phrases like community standards and protecting property values the way a preacher uses scripture, frequent, loud, and selectively applied. I'd bet my orchard she ran for student council every year in high school and won every time, because nobody else wanted it badly enough to run against her. From the moment Ridgecrest opened, Cordelia looked at my 12 acres and saw something that offended her right down to her core. A working farm. Not a charming decorative farm, not a lifestyle Instagram farm with a painted fence and fairy lights. A real, functioning homestead. Raised vegetable beds along the fence line visible from Ridgecrest Drive. Chickens. A greenhouse attached to the barn. An orchard that in late September filled the air with the smell of fermenting apples. Heavy, sweet, faintly boozy, drifting right over her carefully maintained edge. She called it an eyesore at her very first board meeting. Here's what she either didn't know or simply chose to ignore. She had zero legal authority over my property. My land predated her HOA by 50 years. My deed carried no HOA affiliation. I never signed their CC&Rs. I wasn't a member. By every legal standard that actually mattered, Cordelia Vance and her clipboard had no jurisdiction over me, my chickens, or my apple trees. But here's the thing about petty authority. It doesn't wait for jurisdiction. It assumes jurisdiction and dares you to push back. Her first move was that fine notice, $250, certified mail, return receipt required, formatted to look like a serious legal document from a serious governing body. I signed for it, read it once, set it on the kitchen counter next to my coffee mug, and stared at it for a long, quiet moment. Then I picked up the phone and called my neighbor Beaumont Walsh, semi-retired attorney, 3 miles down the county road, the kind of man whose voice makes juries lean forward without knowing why. "Beau," I said, "I think somebody just made a real big mistake." Beaumont came over that same afternoon. He sat on my porch with a glass of sweet tea sweating in the August heat, and read that fine notice twice, front to back, without saying a single word. The only sound was ice shifting in his glass, and one of my hens making her opinions known somewhere in the coop. Then Beaumont set the letter down and said, "This isn't worth the paper it's printed on," which should have been the end of it. Together, we drafted a response, polite, firm, precise. It cited Tennessee property law, the date of my family's deed, the complete absence of any HOA covenant attached to my parcel, and a clear statement that I had zero legal obligation to pay, respond to, or engage with the Ridgecrest HOA board in any capacity whatsoever. I mailed it certified, kept the return receipt, stapled the whole package into a manila folder, and filed it under a tab I labeled simply HOA. I figured that closed it. It did not close it. 3 weeks later, a second notice arrived. This one was longer. Cordelia had apparently consulted a community management consultant, not a real attorney, I'd learn later, but someone who charged $400 an hour to draft official-sounding letters on HOA letterhead. The new notice cited visual blight provisions, an ongoing nuisance activity, and introduced a fine escalation schedule. The original $250, plus a $50 per day accrual for every day the supposed violation continued. At the same time, she'd sent a letter to the county zoning office. Not a formal complaint exactly, more of an inquiry, asking whether agricultural activity within the Ridgecrest zone required a special use permit. The subtext being about as subtle as a billboard. "Please send someone to investigate my neighbor." A county zoning inspector named Gus, a tired man with 17 actual problems on his desk, drove out and walked my property for 20 minutes, found nothing wrong, wrote, "No violation found," on his form, drove away without even getting out of his truck to look at the chickens up close. I almost felt bad for how anticlimactic the whole visit was. I felt a brief flicker of satisfaction. Then I looked out my window. The sign had appeared. Cordelia had commissioned, and I mean actually paid for with HOA funds, a financial decision she would come to deeply regret. A professional vinyl sign, 3 feet wide, mounted directly to the wooden fence running along our shared property boundary. It read, in authoritative black lettering on a white background, "Notice: adjacent property in violation of Ridgecrest community standards. Residents are advised to contact the board with concerns." The sign was physically bolted to a fence post that sat on the property line, meaning Cordelia had installed signage making false public claims about my land on a structure that touched my property, without my knowledge, without my permission, without any legal right to do so. I'm going to be straight with you. It was the smell of that fresh vinyl baking in the August sun that made me genuinely, properly angry. Not the fine notices, not the inspector, that sign, because it was designed with one purpose: to embarrass me in front of the new neighbors who jogged past every morning with their earbuds in, glancing over, forming opinions. It was petty and deliberate and personal, and I was done being polite about it. When Beaumont drove over and saw it, he went quiet in a particular way I'd never seen from him. Then he said something that stopped me cold. "Harlan, pull out your grandfather's deed, the complete survey plat, not just the legal description. I want to see the actual map." I found it exactly where my father told me to keep it, in the fireproof lockbox in the root cellar, tucked behind the deed to the truck. A large folded document, the paper thick and slightly brittle at the fold lines, with property boundaries drawn in blue ink and notarized stamps from 1962. The smell of it hit me when I opened it. Old paper and something faintly metallic, like the inside of an old tin box. It smelled like Earl's hands, like Dale's filing cabinet, like something that had been waiting a long time to be useful. We spread it on the kitchen table under good light. Beaumont put on his reading glasses and traced the property lines with one slow finger. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then he tapped the northeast corner, looked up at me. "You see this boundary line right here?" I leaned in close. "That's the edge of your grandfather's parcel," he said. "Now tell me, where is the Ridgecrest welcome sign? The big stone monument at the community entrance?" Something slow and strange moved through my chest. "It's at the bend," I said, "by the old creek bed." Beaumont took off his glasses, cleaned them with the hem of his shirt, took his time about it. "Right," he said quietly. "So here's a funny little problem. That boundary line, and I want to verify this with a modern survey before we say a word to anyone, but that line runs further east than the creek bed, further east than anyone building that subdivision thought to check." I looked at the map. I looked at where his finger had been. "How much further?" I asked. "Enough," he said. "Enough to matter." The kitchen was completely quiet, except for the ceiling fan wobbling overhead, with its familiar off-kilter tick. Outside, one of my hens clucked once and went silent. I stared at that blue ink line on 60-year-old paper for a long time. Then, slowly, I smiled. Here's what I did with that discovery. Absolutely nothing. I sat on it the way a man sits on a winning hand at a poker table, when there are still cards to be dealt. I kept my face the same. I let Cordelia keep going, and she went. The fine notices kept arriving, now formatted with a running total printed in the upper right corner like a monthly utility bill. The fictitious debt was climbing, $250 original, plus $50 per day, the balance growing week by week into something that was supposed to feel insurmountable. Her management consultant sent a follow-up letter suggesting I was at risk of a community lien proceeding. That was a flat-out lie. The HOA had no legal authority to place a lien on property it held no covenant over, but they were betting I didn't know that. Intimidation through official-looking paperwork is one of the oldest and most reliable tricks in the petty bureaucrat's handbook. It works constantly because most people panic at legal-sounding language and write a check just to make the feeling stop. I didn't panic. I hired a surveyor. His name was Curtis Pruitt. Licensed, unsmiling, wore the same khaki field vest regardless of weather or season. The kind of professional who treats property lines with the gravity of a surgeon treating a wound. I commissioned a full modern boundary survey of the entire Dodd parcel and told Curtis to be thorough. Mark every corner, document everything, leave no question unanswered. Curtis spent 2 full days on my land with his equipment, moving methodically from corner to corner, the crunch of his boots on dry grass the only sound across the whole property on those quiet mornings. On the 3rd day, he knocked on my door and asked if he could sit down. The survey confirmed what Beaumont had suspected. My northeast corner extended significantly further east than anyone associated with the Ridgecrest development had ever bothered to verify. The creek bed had served as a convenient, informal reference point for years, but the actual legal boundary, as precisely described in Earl Dodd's 1962 deed and cross-referenced against county parcel records, was 14 feet further east than that creek. 14 feet. Doesn't sound dramatic, I know, but those 14 feet at exactly that location included the northeast terminus of the Ridgecrest entrance drive, the concrete pad beneath the community's stone monument sign, and this is where I had to set my coffee down, a portion of the underground utility easement running directly to the Ridgecrest gatehouse. The gatehouse, the building where Cordelia held her board meetings, twice a month. I own the ground under her front door. Beaumont and I spent 2 evenings cross-referencing everything against the county GIS parcel database. We confirmed there was no recorded easement, no recorded license agreement, no deed transfer, no recorded permission of any kind authorizing Whitmore Properties or the Ridgecrest HOA to place any structure on or make any use of those 14 feet. It was a developer error, a survey assumption that nobody checked because everyone was moving fast, and nobody asked the right questions at the right time. Here's the legal beat you want to write down. An unrecorded use of someone else's land doesn't automatically create ownership, but in Tennessee, adverse possession can ripen after 7 years of open, continuous, uncontested use. I had time, but I didn't have unlimited time. Meanwhile, Cordelia kept escalating. She called a special board meeting and passed a resolution formally declaring my property a persistent community nuisance and authorizing the board to pursue all available remedies. 4 votes to 1. The single dissenting vote came from a retired gentleman on the board named Fletcher, who told his fellow members the whole campaign was petty, groundless, and likely to cause the HOA serious legal exposure. He said it clearly and on the record. Nobody listened to Fletcher. I made a note to send Fletcher a fruit basket someday. She also started working the neighborhood socially, the way small-town political operators always do, mentioning at the mailbox that my chickens carried disease, suggesting at the community pool that the smell from my orchard was affecting outdoor enjoyment, always implying without quite saying, that the kind of operation I was running was dragging property values down. I heard all of it through my friend Della Crow, who'd bought her Ridgecrest home specifically because she liked living next door to a real working farm. Della was 53, sharp as a tack, and constitutionally incapable of tolerating nonsense. "She's telling people your chickens are a health hazard," Della told me one Saturday over the fence. I told her my kids grew up around chickens and are perfectly fine, and she looked at me like I'd said something criminal. I thanked Della, handed her a dozen eggs and a bag of late-season pears, still warm from the afternoon sun. I also made a mental note. Della, and probably several others in Ridgecrest who were quietly exhausted by Cordelia's administration, might be exactly the allies I'd need when the time came. I filed the survey results in the manila folder, which was getting satisfyingly thick, and I let Cordelia keep running. By month 4, the fictitious running total on paper had climbed past $8,000. That was when Cordelia made her single biggest tactical error. She brought in an attorney. His name was Gavin, solo practice, collections specialty. He took the HOA as a client because it was recurring revenue, and he assumed I'd do what most people do when they get a letter on law firm letterhead: fold immediately and write a check. He sent his letter. It was more impressive looking than the management consultant's letters. It had a proper header, proper formatting, a proper signature block. It was still completely legally empty, but it looked authoritative, and that's usually enough. Gavin threatened to pursue a civil judgment against me for the outstanding balance. He could not get that judgment. I didn't owe that money. I had never owed that money. But Gavin was either too careless to pull the underlying property documents, or was simply betting that I didn't know my rights well enough to call his bluff. That bet gets made constantly in the collections world. It pays off more often than it should. It did not pay off with me. Here's what Gavin didn't fully think through. When an attorney makes false or misleading legal representations in writing as part of what amounts to a debt collection scheme, that doesn't just open a strategic door, it opens a federal one. The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the FDCPA, is a law most people know vaguely as the reason collectors can't call you at 3 a.m. But its teeth go much deeper than that. If a collector, or an attorney acting in a collection capacity, makes false or deceptive representations in an attempt to collect a debt, the person on the receiving end can sue for actual damages, statutory damages up to $1,000, and attorney's fees. Meaning, if I pursued this, Cordelia's HOA could end up paying Beaumont's hourly rate. Takeaway you can actually use. When an attorney tries to collect a debt you don't legally owe, the FDCPA may give you a federal cause of action against them. Google FDCPA false representation attorney debt collection and read up. Beaumont and I sent Gavin a formal FDCPA dispute letter, certified mail, return receipt. We stated clearly that the alleged debt was invalid, disputed in full, and that I was preserving every right available to me under federal and state consumer protection law. We attached my deed, the county parcel map, Gus's zoning inspection report showing 0 violations, and my original response letter from month 1. All of it, organized, documented, and impossible to misread. Gavin went completely quiet after that. His name vanished from all further correspondence, but Cordelia did not go quiet. Cordelia adapted. She filed a formal complaint with the county health department, claiming my chicken operation created unsanitary conditions. A health inspector came out, walked the coop, spent about 15 minutes looking around, found nothing wrong, and left without writing a single citation. I've been keeping chickens since I was 12 years old. That coop was cleaner than some restaurant kitchens. The man had probably visited that same week, and I think he knew it. Then she went further. She appeared during public comment at a county commissioners meeting and delivered a prepared statement, actual printed copies distributed to the commissioners, about unregulated agricultural activity adjacent to planned residential infrastructure, and the urgent need for updated rural-urban interface zoning policies. She brought photographs of my property, apparently taken from the public road, and passed them around the room like exhibit materials. The gravel crunch of her Lexus leaving that county parking lot probably sounded very satisfying to her. What she didn't know was that I was in that meeting room. I was sitting in the back row in my clean flannel shirt and good boots, watching her work, taking notes in a small spiral notebook. I didn't speak. I didn't raise my hand. I just listened carefully and wrote down every specific factual claim she made, because false statements made to government officials in an official proceeding carry their own separate legal implications, and I wanted a complete record. I also noticed, on the public comment sign-in sheet, which I photographed with my phone, that Cordelia had listed her home address, a Ridgecrest address, her house, a house whose HOA entrance infrastructure, I now knew beyond any legal doubt, was sitting on 14 feet of land that belonged to my family since before Cordelia was old enough to vote. I drove home in the dark on the county road with my window cracked. October air coming in, dry leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the hollow, the kind of smell that belongs to Tennessee evenings and nowhere else on earth. I thought about the Ridgecrest board meeting schedule posted on their community website. Twice a month, open to the public. I wasn't a Ridgecrest resident. I had never been a Ridgecrest resident, but my land was. My land had been there decades before theirs, and I was just about ready to remind everyone of that fact in a way they wouldn't forget. The piece that changed everything didn't arrive with any drama. It came in a plain manila envelope from the County Register of Deeds, 3 weeks after I'd submitted a public records request for every document ever filed in connection with the Whitmore Properties development of the Ridgecrest parcel. Beaumont and I went through it on a Saturday afternoon at my kitchen table. Thick stack of photocopies, title searches, survey plats, easement filings, original construction permit applications, the whole paper trail of a development that moved too fast and checked too little. 2 mugs of coffee going cold, ceiling fan clicking overhead. Halfway through the stack, Beaumont stopped. He pulled a single document from the pile and set it flat on the table, smoothing it carefully with his palm. It was the original title insurance commitment that Whitmore Properties had obtained before breaking ground on Ridgecrest. And buried in the Schedule B exceptions section, the part of a title commitment that lists what the insurance specifically doesn't cover, was a notation I had to read twice to fully believe. It flagged the Dodd parcel boundary as an unresolved overlap in the northeast corner, and explicitly noted that the condition required independent surveyor verification before the construction of any improvements within 20 feet of that corner. Whitmore had checked the acknowledgement box, then built the entrance drive and monument sign anyway, without resolving the condition, which meant their title insurance didn't cover the encroachment, which meant their insurer, a major national company with a very motivated in-house legal team, was exposed to liability if I pressed my boundary claim formally. But that still wasn't the best part. Beaumont kept reading. And then, near the bottom of the stack, he started laughing. A quiet, slow, sustained sound I had genuinely never heard from him before in all the years I'd known him. "What?" I said. He turned a document around and pushed it across the table to me. It was the recorded declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions for Ridgecrest, the CC&Rs, the governing document that every single homeowner had relied on when they signed their purchase contract. He pointed to Article 14, Section 3. The section heading read, "Developers' representations regarding adjacent property." The text, in relevant part. Whitmore Properties represents that the community's common areas, entrance improvements, and infrastructure are sited entirely within the platted boundaries of the Ridgecrest development, and that no portion of said improvements encroaches upon adjacent private property. Whitmore had made that statement, in a recorded binding legal instrument, to every one of the 140 families who bought a home in Ridgecrest, and it was false. Demonstrably, documentably, surveyably false. That wasn't just an encroachment claim anymore. That was a potentially fraudulent misrepresentation in a recorded covenant. Every homeowner who had relied on that statement when they purchased their home had a potential grievance against the developer who made it. And it gave Beaumont leverage, not just against the HOA board that had been harassing me, but against the company that created the entire problem in the first place. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. "So," I said, "Cordelia has been fining me for farming on my own land. Her HOA's front entrance is sitting on my land, and the developer who built the whole community lied about all of it in writing to every single homeowner." "That's correct," Beaumont said. "And she has absolutely no idea. Not one clue. Outside, my chickens were going about their afternoon business. The apple trees were holding their last fruit of the season. The sun was getting low over the ridge. I picked up my cold coffee and took a long, slow sip. "All right, Beau," I said, "let's plan this right. Here's what separates someone who actually wins from someone who just gets angrier and angrier until the anger consumes them. The person who wins slows all the way down at exactly the moment when every instinct screams to charge forward. I learned that from farming. You cannot rush a harvest. You can water it, tend it, protect it from frost, but you cannot make the fruit ripen faster by wanting it harder. You prepare, you wait, and when the moment finally arrives, you don't have to hurry because you already did all the work weeks ago." So Beaumont and I planned, carefully and methodically, over 6 weeks. What we built wasn't one dramatic confrontation. It was a sequence, each piece designed to activate the next one, like dominoes set on a deliberate slope by someone who's already calculated exactly where they'll all fall. The first move was the title insurance company. Beaumont drafted a formal notice to the insurer that had underwritten Whitmore's development, identifying the encroachment by precise survey coordinates, citing the Schedule B exception that had been flagged and then completely ignored, and formally notifying them that I intended to assert my full property rights unless the matter was properly resolved. Title insurance companies despise this kind of letter. It exists because they failed at the single job they were paid to do. Within 2 weeks, the insurer's in-house counsel had contacted Beaumont and expressed interest in what they diplomatically called exploring resolution options. That's institutional lawyer language for, "We looked at this and we know we have a problem." I set that card face down on the table and moved to the next one. The second move was the Ridgecrest homeowners themselves. Beaumont drafted a letter addressed to the full HOA membership. Factual, not inflammatory. The kind of document a reader could independently verify with a trip to the county register of deeds. It described the encroachment in plain terms, cited the Article 14 covenant in which Whitmore had misrepresented the property boundaries, and explained that the HOA's entrance infrastructure was sited on private property without authorization. It didn't threaten anyone. It informed them, and it advised them, as parties to a potentially fraudulent developer representation, to consult their own attorneys. I had Della review the tone before we sent it. She suggested one addition, a line noting that this dispute had begun when the HOA board initiated a fine campaign against a neighboring property owner over whom it had no legal authority whatsoever, accumulating a fictitious $8,000 debt, while the board president appeared to be completely unaware that the HOA's own front entrance sat on that same neighbor's land. Della called it providing context. I called it the single best sentence in the letter. Getting the homeowner mailing list was simpler than most people realize. In Tennessee, HOA membership rosters and all recorded governing documents are public record when filed with the county. I submitted a public records request, paid a small copying fee, and had 140 names and mailing addresses by Thursday afternoon. Takeaway: in most states, your HOA's membership list and recorded CC and Rs are public record. Search your county register of deeds online, and you can often pull them yourself for free. I sent the letter certified mail to all 140. The third piece was the local newspaper, specifically the Cookeville Herald, and a reporter named Suzanne, who had covered municipal and property issues for years. She had a documented history of stories about developers cutting corners and homeowners getting caught in the fallout. Beaumont reached out to her editor, not to pitch a story, but to offer access. If Suzanne was interested in a story involving HOA enforcement overreach, a developer's fraudulent covenant, and a boundary dispute with serious implications for 140 homeowner titles. I would speak entirely on the record. Suzanne called within 24 hours. We sat on my porch for 2 hours. I showed her everything. The 1962 deed, the 2024 survey, the title insurance commitment with its ignored exception, the stack of fine notices with their escalating fictional totals, and the Article 14 provision where Whitmore told every homeowner the entrance was clear of encroachments. Suzanne asked precise questions in a narrow reporter's notebook and didn't editorialize once. At the end, she looked up and said, "When are you planning to move on this?" "Soon," I said. "Can I be there when you do?" I was counting on it. The fourth and final piece was the most procedurally important. I retained a real property specialist, a dedicated real estate litigator, not just Beaumont's generalist background, and filed a quiet title action on the disputed 14-foot strip. A quiet title proceeding asks a court to conclusively establish ownership of a contested parcel. Once filed, it becomes public record. It puts the entire world on formal notice that ownership is actively disputed. It stops any adverse possession clock from ticking. And it creates an official court filing that every interested party, the newspaper, the title insurer, 140 homeowners, the county, can point to as the legal record of what's actually happening here. Takeaway: a quiet title action is the proper legal mechanism to resolve disputed boundaries permanently. Google quiet title action plus your state name to understand the timeline and process. By the time the December HOA board meeting rolled around, every domino was standing exactly where I'd placed it. All I had to do was show up and tip the first one. The certified letters reached 140 Ridgecrest mailboxes on a Thursday. By Friday evening, Cordelia's phone was going straight to voicemail. By Saturday morning, she'd called an emergency board meeting in the gatehouse, sitting without the faintest idea on my land, with all 5 board members, the management consultant, and an atmosphere you could have cut with a fence post. Word came back to me through Della, who had a genuine gift for being in exactly the right hallway at exactly the right moment, without anyone finding it suspicious. Cordelia's initial position was dismissive. She told the board the letters were a scare tactic from a hostile neighbor, and that the claims were already under legal review. She said it in her particular voice, the one calibrated to sound definitive and close off further questions. It worked on the board. It did not work on the homeowners. 3 of them showed up to that emergency meeting without being invited. They wanted to know, in direct terms, whether their property values were legally at risk because the developer had made a false representation in the recorded CC and Rs they had each signed at closing. That's not an abstract legal question for a homeowner. That's a question about the single largest financial asset most of them own. Cordelia did not have a satisfying answer. There is no satisfying answer when the honest answer is yes. Her response was to double down publicly. She began stating openly at neighborhood gatherings, not hinting anymore, actually stating, that I was operating an illegal commercial farm, selling produce without a business license, and deliberately contaminating the local watershed with agricultural runoff from my property. None of it was true. I grew food for myself and my household, gave the surplus to neighbors in the local food bank, had no commercial operation of any kind, and had maintained my drainage responsibly my entire life. My family had been managing that watershed since before the Ridgecrest subdivision existed as anything other than someone else's cornfield. But Cordelia was playing to an audience that didn't have the time or inclination to verify specific claims, and she understood that a confident false statement, repeated enough times in casual social settings, starts to carry the weight of fact. What she didn't account for was Della's phone sitting on the table. At a neighborhood watch meeting held in someone's 3-car garage, 20 Ridgecrest residents, folding chairs, Cordelia at the front. Della had her phone out the entire time, visibly taking notes. She was a participant in that conversation. In Tennessee, any party to a conversation can legally record it without notifying the other participants. One-party consent state. Takeaway: look up your state's recording consent laws before you do this. In one-party consent states, you have this right, but the rules vary significantly by state. Della sent me the recording that night. I listened to it at my kitchen table in the quiet after dinner. Heard Cordelia's voice coming through the phone speaker, crisp, certain, completely confident. delivering specific, verifiable falsehoods about my property and my character to a room full of my neighbors. I sent the file to Beaumont. I sent it to Suzanne. Beaumont flagged it carefully. False statements about a private individual's specific business practices, made publicly to a group with apparent intent to damage their reputation, have a name in the law: defamation. The statements were specific enough and demonstrably false enough to support a serious claim. I decided to hold it. Not because it didn't matter. It absolutely mattered. But because I understood that releasing everything at once is like planting all your seeds on the same day. You don't get a harvest. You get confusion. I wanted this story to land in sequence, one piece at a time, so that everyone watching could follow exactly what happened and why. Inside Ridgecrest, the board itself was fracturing. Fletcher had by now moved from quiet dissent to active conversation with other homeowners, telling anyone who asked that the campaign against me had been a mistake from the beginning, and that the board had real fiduciary exposure for continuing it. 2 other board members were asking the HOA's insurance carrier whether their directors and officers policy covered enforcement actions taken against non-members. It did not, as it turned out. Their carrier confirmed this in writing. I was sleeping well. The trees were pruned. The root cellar was full. The quiet title action was moving through the courts on its own steady schedule. I was waiting for one final piece to fall into place before I moved. The final piece came from the direction I least expected: Whitmore Properties itself. When Beaumont's formal notice reached the title insurer, the insurer immediately did what large institutional players always do when they detect liability. They notified Whitmore Properties directly. Whitmore's general counsel, a polished corporate attorney based in Nashville named Bradford, called Beaumont within a week. The conversation was professionally careful. Bradford wanted to understand the full scope of my boundary claim, the strength of Curtis Pruitt's survey documentation, and whether I would be open to what he called a quiet resolution. What he meant was, what number makes this go away? He offered a figure. It wasn't a small figure. I told Beaumont to tell him I'd think about it. I had no intention of taking it, but I need to think it over accomplishes 2 things simultaneously. It confirms that the other side has looked at the evidence and knows they have a genuine problem, and it buys time for everything else I'd set in motion to continue developing. A developer's legal team that volunteers a settlement offer before litigation begins has already done the math and doesn't like the answer. What Bradford's call also provided, without intending to, was something more valuable than any dollar amount: an implicit acknowledgement, documented in an attorney-to-attorney exchange, that Whitmore was aware of the encroachment and classified it as a liability. That acknowledgement had strategic value far exceeding the number Bradford had offered. Beaumont noted every detail in his file. I told Bradford we'd be in touch. Meanwhile, inside Ridgecrest, a retired engineer named Preston had evolved from a concerned questioner into a genuine internal organizer. Preston had spent 35 years building structures and understood viscerally what it meant to put something up on land you didn't have clear title to. After receiving my homeowner letter, he'd spent a weekend pulling the county GIS maps, cross-referencing them against his own purchase documents, and concluded independently that my claim was solid and the Article 14 issue was real. He started holding informal meetings in his own garage. Folding chairs, printed handouts, no board members invited. He walked his neighbors through the covenant misrepresentation issue in the methodical, diagram-supported way that engineers explain things, which is to say, in a way that is nearly impossible to argue with emotionally, because it contains no emotion at all, just evidence and logical conclusions drawn from that evidence. By the end of his 3rd garage meeting, 6 homeowners had independently contacted attorneys. 2 had reached out to Suzanne at the Herald on their own. The story was no longer something I was managing from the outside. It had taken on its own life from within the community. Cordelia's response was to accelerate in the only direction she seemed to know. At the November board meeting, she attempted to pass a resolution authorizing legal action against me for, I want you to appreciate this, trespass by overhanging tree branches. The same orchard my grandfather planted in the 1970s, whose branches extended naturally a few feet over the fence line, as 60-year-old trees are inclined to do. She had actually prepared documentation on this. She had a printed exhibit. The resolution failed 4 votes to 1. Her vote was the one. She sat at the head of that table in the gatehouse, on my land, in a building on my land, with her gavel and her printed agenda, and the room had simply moved past her. Not with drama, not with confrontation. It just went around her, the way water eventually finds a way around anything that tries to stop it. That same week, working 2 quiet weekends with Curtis Pruitt, I installed proper survey markers along the true boundary line. Standard metal stakes, orange-capped, driven flush with the ground at each legally surveyed corner point. These are entirely ordinary instruments of property law. When filed with the county as part of a recorded plat, they constitute formal legal notice of where a property line is. Every licensed surveyor in Tennessee uses them. They mean exactly one thing. I placed them precisely where the survey said the line ran. One stake ended up positioned 8 inches from the concrete pad of Cordelia's monument sign. Small, orange, completely unremarkable unless you understood property law. If you did understand property law, the story those stakes told was impossible to misread. That evening I sat on my porch in the November cold and looked out at the orchard going dormant for winter. I thought about Earl clearing this hillside. I thought about Dale building the house that was keeping the wind off me right now. I thought about the root cellar full of food I'd grown, and the chickens roosting in the coop, and 12 acres that nobody had ever been able to take from this family, and never would. Then I picked up my phone and sent 3 messages. To Suzanne, next Tuesday. December board meeting. Bring your photographer. To Preston, I'll be there at 6:25. You'll want a seat near the front. To Della, bring the recording, just in case. Then I went inside, heated up my dinner, and slept better than I had in months. The Ridgecrest HOA, December board meeting, second Tuesday, 6:30 p.m. in the gatehouse at the community entrance. A well-lit building with glass front doors, fully visible from the driveway. 30 homeowners turned out that night, nearly double the usual attendance. Preston had sent an email to the full neighborhood listserv that afternoon, noting that the meeting would address important property boundary matters affecting all Ridgecrest homeowners. He did not soften the urgency. Suzanne arrived at 6:15 with a photographer. She'd confirmed with her editor that morning that the story was running in the Thursday edition, regardless of what happened tonight. The quiet title filing was already public court record. The attorney-to-attorney acknowledgement from Whitmore's counsel was documented, and the entire fine campaign had been independently verified against my deed and parcel history. Tonight was for the visual record. Tonight was for the faces. I pulled up in my truck at 6:22. Parked on the public street, and walked up the entrance drive toward the gatehouse. I passed Cordelia's stone monument sign. I passed the small orange survey stake sitting 8 inches from its concrete pad. I walked through the glass front doors of the gatehouse, nodded at Preston in the front row, found Della 3 seats over, and took an aisle seat in the second row. I was not a Ridgecrest homeowner. I had no membership standing in the conventional sense, but the meeting was publicly posted as open to all on the HOA's own community website. And I wasn't attending as a neighbor or a grievant. I was attending as the property owner, whose land this meeting room was partially occupying without authorization. Cordelia was already at the head table when I came through the door. She saw me the moment I walked in. I watched her face change. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something more specific than that. It was the expression of someone who has just registered, for the first time, that the situation they thought they were managing has already moved somewhere they don't control. She called the meeting to order and moved through the preliminary agenda items with the precise mechanical efficiency of someone performing calm rather than feeling it. Then, before Preston could raise his hand, she announced that the board would not be addressing the Dodd boundary matter at tonight's meeting as it was currently under active legal review. She delivered it in her closing voice, the tone calibrated to feel definitive, and shut down further inquiry. Preston raised his hand anyway. "Point of order," he said, pleasantly and clearly. "Is this building currently subject to a recorded adverse claim filed in Putnam County Circuit Court?" The room went still. People reached for phones. "That claim is entirely frivolous and will be..." "Yes or no," Preston said, still pleasant, not moving. "Has a quiet title action been filed naming this physical location in its legal description? Yes or no?" The management consultant began typing very rapidly on his laptop. The sound of it was the only thing moving in the room. "I'd also like to note," Preston continued, producing a printed sheet from his jacket pocket, that I have a copy of the notice of encroachment served on this board 10 days ago, informing the board that this entrance drive and this gatehouse are partially sited on the private property of Mr. Harlan Dodd. Information that was not disclosed to the membership. Someone in the third row said, out loud, "What?" That was when I stood up. Quietly. No drama, no performance. I introduced myself. I'm Harlan Dodd. I own the adjacent property, and there are some things I think the membership deserves to hear directly. And then I laid out the entire situation in plain language. The 1962 deed, the 2024 survey, the 14 feet, the entrance drive, the gatehouse floor we were all standing on, the Article 14 covenant in which Whitmore Properties had represented to every person in this room that no HOA improvements encroached on adjacent private property, the $8,000 in fictitious fines levied against a landowner the HOA had no legal authority over, while that same HOA's front entrance sat on that landowner's family land. 4 minutes. Kitchen table language. Nothing a reasonable person couldn't follow. I held up the survey plat so the room could see it clearly. Suzanne's photographer took the picture. It ran on the front page of the Cookeville Herald 2 days later. Me, standing inside the Ridgecrest Gatehouse, holding the plat map on my own land. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in the specific sound of 30 people asking the questions they should have been asking for over a year. Who is the HOA's attorney? What does this mean for our titles? Can we recover damages from Whitmore? Does the board's insurance cover any of this? Cordelia tried to regain control of the meeting 3 separate times. Each time, people talked right through her. The board voted, then and there, to immediately suspend all enforcement activity against my property, pending full legal review. 4 votes to 1. Cordelia's was the one. She sat at the head of her table, with her printed agenda and her gavel, and the meeting had gone entirely around her. She was still in her chair. She was still at the front of the room, but the room no longer belonged to her, and every person in it understood that now. The Cookeville Herald headline ran Thursday morning. Local homeowner fined for farming. Turns out he owned the land they were standing on. Below the fold, the photograph. I wasn't smiling for the camera. I wasn't performing anything. I was just a man standing on his own land. The quiet title action settled out of court 4 months after that meeting. Whitmore Properties, strongly encouraged by a title insurer that had no appetite whatsoever for contested litigation over a provable, documented survey error, agreed to a formal recorded boundary correction, an official acknowledgement of the Dodd parcel line, and a payment covering my legal fees, my survey costs, and a negotiated figure for years of uncompensated use of my 14 feet. The specific amount wasn't disclosed publicly. What I'll tell you is that it was enough to re-roof the farmhouse completely, rebuild the east wall of the barn where the winter rot had been getting serious for years, and put a meaningful remainder into an account I named after my father, the Dale Dodd Land Stewardship Fund. The Ridgecrest HOA filed its own separate legal action against Whitmore Properties over the Article 14 misrepresentation, the one where the developer told 140 families in writing that no improvements encroached on adjacent land. That litigation was still in process the last I heard, but Preston had been elected board president by a 7-1 vote, with Cordelia having resigned from the board in January. She submitted her resignation by email at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'll give her this, she was consistent to the end. Gavin, the collections attorney who had sent threatening demand letters on behalf of an HOA that held no authority over me, had a formal complaint submitted to the state bar for review. Those proceedings move at their own pace. I'm patient. Cordelia moved out of Ridgecrest that spring. Nobody made an announcement. It was just noticed gradually. Her parking space empty, the diagonal parked Lexus no longer there. The way you notice the absence of something unpleasant that had become background noise. But the part of this story I actually think about, the part I tell when I tell it, isn't the settlement or the boundary correction or Cordelia's exit. It's what happened with the land itself. After the Herald story ran, I started getting calls and emails I hadn't expected. The County Agricultural Extension Office, a couple of local high schools, families from inside Ridgecrest who had never once thought about where their food came from, until they read about a working farm sitting right on the other side of their subdivision fence. Some of them wanted to see it. Some of them wanted to help. So I opened it up. I partnered with the Extension Office and 2 area high schools to run a working homestead education program on my 12 acres. Saturday mornings, late spring through early fall. Students, most of them from families with no rural background, kids who had never planted a seed, never held a chicken, never understood what soil actually is or does, spending their mornings learning the real basics: soil composition and composting, orchard management and seasonal pruning, animal husbandry, basic food preservation. I taught the sessions myself, with help from Della, and eventually from Preston's wife, who turned out to hold a master's degree in horticulture she had been quietly keeping in reserve for 20 years and was absolutely ready to use. In the second year, we added a scholarship, funded by the Dale Dodd Land Stewardship Fund, awarded annually to a graduating senior from either partner school who planned to study agricultural science, environmental stewardship, or rural land management at the college level. The first recipient was a girl named Waverly. She'd grown up in a Ridgecrest colonial 2 blocks from my fence line and had no idea there was a working farm next door until she saw the newspaper story. She knocked on my door the following summer and asked if she could help. I handed her a pair of work gloves and put her to work the same afternoon. She is going to be excellent at whatever she decides to do with her life. I'm already certain of it. Before I let you go, the practical takeaways, because I know a lot of you are here for exactly this. First, pull your deed, read it, know your exact boundary lines, and cross-reference them with your county's online GIS parcel viewer. Most counties have one, it's free, and it takes 15 minutes. Second, if an HOA is fining you and you never sign their CC and Rs, you may owe them nothing at all. Don't pay anything before talking to a real property attorney. Third, the FDCPA applies when attorneys try to collect debts you don't legally owe. Document everything in writing, dispute formally, preserve every right you have. Fourth, a quiet title action is your legal tool for putting a disputed boundary on the permanent record. Google it for your specific state. And fifth, this one's mine, not from any law book. The person who holds the actual deed doesn't need to be the loudest one in the room. They just need to be patient and prepared. I was both.
So that's Helen's story. A $250 fine for farming lands his family had owned since 1962. Cordelia thought she has owned the power. Turns out she was holding that clipboard on somebody else's property the whole time. 60 years old did, one surveyor. 6 weeks of silence. That was his entire strategy. No screaming matches, no angry posts, no courtroom drama. Just a man who did his homework while Cordelia kept digging her own grave 5 notice at a time. Most people react, Helen's prepare. And that's difference cost Cordelia her position, her credibility, and her precious HOA entrance, built on land that was never hers to begin with. I know some of you are dealing with your own version of this right now. Maybe it's not a farm, maybe it's a fence, a shed, a flag on your own property. But that feeling of someone with a little authority deciding your land is their business. Yeah, we know that feeling. So tell me, what's the most ridiculous thing your HOA ever fined you for? Drop it below. If this hits close to home, share it with someone fighting their own Cordelia. Subscribe to HOA Stories because next time we got a city water authority building 1 man illegally for 22 years. You won't want to miss this. Know your rights, know your rights. Never let a clipboard tell you what to do on your own land.